Hey everyone, you're in good traffic. Thanks for coming back for another week of the show, another episode of the show. I'm joined this week by a guest that I am very excited to talk to about a topic that I think is pertinent and also super catalyzing for a lot of these urbanism and urban design conversations that we've had on this show and that are happening in ancillary circles around the country, we hope, at this point. I'm joined today by Mr. Money Mustache, kind of one of the main voices of this movement of frugality and kind of just financial smarts and independence in the United States over the last, decade plus here. So first of all, thank you so much for coming on the show today and for taking some time to talk about urbanism, which hopefully is a little bit of a mix-up from some of the things that you are normally discussing on these shows that you frequent.
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks, Brad. And it's great that we're neighbors, so I could just walk over here and join your podcast. But secondly, that is one of my big passions. Like, I've written about this a couple times. I try not to do it too much because I know people are coming to my website to hear about how to get richer. But secretly, the stuff I care about most is more like this kind of thing, like how to make the United States and other rich countries into more people-friendly, livable, more fun places to live that also just happen to consume less energy and are more sustainable. So it's basically a win-win, but on the living side rather than just on the dollars side.
Absolutely. And I say it somewhat jokingly. I actually personally think that our conversations are extremely connected to each other. And I think that the personal finance angle, for lack of a better term, to the push and the pitch to people to go car light or car free, or to just start to look for alternate modes of transportation, for different ways to offset their cost of living. I think that is the strongest argument for urbanism, for people-centered urban design. And I know the environmental arguments get a lot of the headway, EVs and all these things. We hear about them in the media a lot. And not that I don't think those are important, but I think the argument that you have made, that kind of the angle that you've taken to this conversation is one that I think people of any political orientation, people of any background can get behind, which is this actually saves you money. Living in these certain ways saves you money. So with that in mind, I was telling you earlier that I initially learned about you in 2017 through a Tim Ferriss podcast, which I remember you I think early on in that conversation said something along the lines of talked about how your grocery shopping routine was very much revolving around biking to the grocery store in Colorado where you live at. And I remember at the time, because I wasn't thinking of things through an urbanism mindset, that didn't really ring a bell. But now in hindsight, I look back and go, oh, we're making this intentional decision around transportation, around mobility from a finance lens way before cul-de-sac, way before all these concepts. So I'd love to start off could you give a little background on your, for lack of better terms, origin story into urbanism and being interested in urban planning and ultimately applying it to your life as someone who prioritizes frugality above all else?
Yeah, that's a funny question. I don't think I've ever had that exact question before, but I like it. So I think what boils down to, I always thought the idea of wasting your time, I just never really wanted to do that. So as I became a young adult and I moved out of my small town where I grew up and I started getting these jobs, like adult jobs as an engineering intern, I was like, well, of course I should get a place to live as close as possible to work. And I don't want to have to drive there because driving is expensive. And also driving is, slow and frustrating and subject to the whims of other drivers and traffic jams and stuff. Yes. So even my very first job, I always picked a place to live where I could bike to work. And then I just continued that. And I remember later on in that same early part of my career, I started, gathering friends, and we would rent these big luxury houses and carve them up into bedrooms so we could all live like in a party palace but still have cheap rent.
Yeah.
But then I was having arguments with them because the guys I was with were like, let's get a place right next to downtown because then we could all go out to bars and, and like walk home and have this party lifestyle. But the place where we all worked was the high-tech company. And that was like 15 or 20 miles away from the downtown in this big city. It was Ottawa, Canada. And I was like, no, we got to live next to work because we go to work every day and we only go out to the bars on the weekends. So that's like 5 times more often.
Yeah.
So if you have to do a commute, you should do it like less often. So I remember having this battle and we ended up settling for a place in the middle initially. And then every time we moved to a new house, we would have the battle again, and I would find us a new house just a bit closer to work, to work. And then, it felt like a win. And I still think it was great because we would all end up not having to drive much. And we carpooled and we biked and saved a ton of money. And of course, going out is something that happens less as you grow up anyway. Like you don't go out drinking as your entertainment.
Sure.
By the time you get to be a real adult, that's only like in your college and shortly after your years.
Yeah. Interesting. So when did you start applying then? Because obviously that feels like a very intentional choice. You were thinking of it in a very logical way. If we go to work more than we go anywhere else, so it makes sense to live closer to there than any other, location or kind of modality that you choose for fun or whatever it may be. But when did you really start applying kind of the financial lens to that? Was that from day one? Was it, oh, this is going to save us a lot of money? Or was it as you started to do it, you started to realize we're saving a lot of money by not taking certain mode of transportation or owning a car, doing things like that?
I'd say it was right from the beginning because I knew how much it cost to drive a car. And the younger you are, like the less money you have, the more that's a big deal, right? Like even the price of a tank of gas is a big deal when you're in high school.
Right.
And then you get to be like the next level of income, and then gasoline's not such a big deal, but the cost of the car is still a big deal. And then the problem is most people don't realize that. And then the higher income you get, you kind of just like, it falls into the noise of your spending because you're spending so much on everything else. Sure. But even on a pretty high income family, the car is a big thing. Like I remember reading recently, like the average American family spends something like $9,000 a year per driver for their car expenses, just to drive around. Probably almost all of it is unnecessary if they were thinking about it differently. And so I was always keen, even in my early 20s, to keep that number as close to zero, even though I liked cars. I had like a nice car, a nice motorcycle, but I wanted to make sure I only used them when I really was enjoying it. So I'd use them for like, date night or camping trips, but I didn't want to just waste my nice car driving back and forth to work.
Interesting. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I think it speaks to the numbness that we all seem to have to autocentricity, right? We all just kind of don't even think twice about what we're doing when we go to, drive a multi-ton block of metal to get a like couple of ounce grocery run, or like, oh, I need some bread or cheese. I'm going to go drive my Suburban to pick that up. And we don't understand how incongruent that equation is, how little sense that actually makes from a logic perspective of like you line that up. It's wild.
It's so ridiculous. I mean, people really need to try pushing their car or truck around the block just once. And then you understand how much energy you're wasting when you drive the vehicle. Cause it's like, you're going to get super tired even pushing that thing like 3 houses down the street. And then you realize, oh yeah, okay, that's why it's so expensive, because this is a giant machine. And it's great if you're really using it. Like if you got 5 passengers and all of your stuff and you're rocketing across the mountains, that's a great reason for cars to exist. But just only use them for those good things. And then you can use your bike for the little things, like going over to the grocery store to grab a few pounds or a few tens of pounds of groceries. That fits right in your back.
Yeah. I mean, and we both have done a lot of grocery trips that way. And I think a lot of people have just never seen it. You grew up in the suburbs, you don't see people biking to the grocery store. You don't experience how that's even a possibility. So I think from a visibility standpoint, I've seen TikToks recently of people just freaking out of this person's carrying all those bags on their bike, strapping things to stuff. And
oh, you mean the guy with the scooter where
you've seen that one?
And he puts like 500 shopping bags. That's so stupid.
Yeah.
Because I feel like it's reinforcing the misconception that scooters and bikes aren't good for groceries. And all that guy really needed was a backpack.
Yeah.
Or like a couple saddlebags or whatever. And then he wouldn't have had all this ridiculous trouble, because plastic shopping bags are stupid. And of course you can't ride a vehicle with 2 wheels.
Sure.
So anyway, that video made me mad.
No, and yeah, that's an interesting take on that. I think for me, those sorts of videos always make me think of proximity to grocery stores, and brings it back to zoning of like, if we had shops closer to home, we wouldn't have to get as many bags as that guy had on his bike to take, because he'd be able to go every day, and just get a little bit. And I always then bring that back to, we have smaller kitchens then, because we wouldn't have to store as much food. So then our square footage goes down, cost of living goes down. Like we can fit more units, house more people. So the grocery store thing is a weirdly like very nuanced and also very consequential thing, I think, in urban planning that it weirdly does not get talked about enough. The way we have decided grocery stores work in this country, I think, has outlaid a lot of the other things that have come about the built environment, just because of how we're forced to live, because of how we have to buy our food.
Interesting. That's something I never thought of, but yeah, I could be down with the local market. That I walk to more frequently.
Yeah, because you think about when you go to, a European city or even places like New York, and people have smaller kitchens, but they also have a much greater proximity to fresher food. That's the other thing. When it's not in a store that people go to once a week, in theory, less preservatives can be used because people are frequenting more. The shelves are getting turned over more, and then you can have less storage in your home. Like the cabinets are behind the camera. No one can see that on the podcast, but half of those are empty, and even if they were full, it would kind of beg the question of, if I can fill those up with food that I'm not going to eat for a month and a half, is that really what I want to be putting in my body? I don't know,
Yeah.
So I think that all comes back to the urban planning conversation, weirdly. And I think that that's something that, that video makes me think of. And also a lot of what you talk about kind of makes me think of, just in terms of how we're wasting or using resources in space, and in this case, kitchen cabinets, but also just how necessary are certain purchases. I'm curious, you've obviously had a lot of success with your message around personal finance. Why? I know this might sound like a basic question, but I think there's a kind of a psychological answer that plays into the larger urban planning bit, which is, why do you think that people are so receptive to the message of frugality? Why is that something that so many people, are just open to, but maybe also they just haven't heard before?
Well, I would say they're not open to it in general,
Okay.
because most people think that frugality means deprivation, and they think it's hard. And there's like a lot of negativity, partly driven by advertising in the United States, where spending more is good, spending less is automatically bad. In fact, some people, even in the government documents on the census, they use the term quality of life as equivalent to level of spending, which is completely like two different things. So I always try to break those things separately. And I like to use the word choice, like your chosen level of spending, to remind people like, no, it's not the quality of your life. And it's also, there's no such thing as living expenses. There's spending choices. And then once you empower people with those words, then you can really break down frugality and make it not sound like a bad thing.
Yeah.
And it's actually just a skill. What you're trying to do is have the most satisfaction and the most like powerful, great, free life, hopefully at a reasonable cost, like minimize the amount of wasted money, that any money you spend is going to something that you actually care about.
Yeah.
So that's what I focus on. And I also focus on the idea of early retirement, which is, much more powerful and desirable thing than just like being stingy, because nobody wants to be stingy. Nobody should be cheap, which I define as, being frugal in a way that affects other people negatively. You don't want to do that. That's like, there's so much money in the United States. You generally don't have to do that, thankfully. But yeah, I'm just trying to get people to be thoughtful about their spending and waste less money. That leaves more money for things you care about, including purchasing your own freedom, which comes from owning stuff, like owning assets, owning your house, which allows you to have more income and less expenses and less interest cost from debt. So that's what I'm all about. I really don't talk about the F word too much, because it scares people off, really.
Interesting. Yeah, that's so true. The perception of it, I think, is one thing. And, you mentioned the cost of car ownership or usership even in a household being, you said 9,000. I hear estimates up to 20, depending on, what kind of car you have, how much you drive, all that's what, your maintenance cost, those things. But we look at something like that being a stasis in the United States, right? The cost of owning a car. Then you look at things like, what we have 61%, I think, of people that are in credit card debt, averaging over $5,000. We look at, Harvard, their Center for Housing just put out a new study that over half of renters in the United States now are spending over 30% of income on housing, which means they're, rent burdened or rent strained. All of these things combining into one moment, right, in the United States right now. And it feels like your message is more relevant than ever for reasons that are very tied to cost of living and built environment. When you think about how you're approaching your conversation, Do you see that angle to things, that transportation housing costs, to be a big part of what you think you might talk about in the coming years, or what maybe you even are focusing on right now, or even just internally thinking about as well? I'm very curious how that sort of momentum that is very clear as it pertains to cost influences how you kind of approach your conversation and your audience.
I think of transportation and housing as pretty separate things. So transportation, there's no reason that should cost you much of anything. You know, you can design your life so that you walk and bike almost everywhere. And then if you need a car, you can have it, you know, a cheap one that you don't use very much, and you get a reliable one. You don't get a truck. And then, you know, that's going to be just a couple $1,000s a year. So that's, transportation should be low. Housing, I don't really care if people spend more on housing, because if you're having a family, or even if you're just like a single or a couple and you like to host and have like a comfortable living space, it might be quite reasonable to spend more on that. And I've always prioritized housing. Like, I've always had nice houses, and I like to have a lot of space. So that's not, I don't have like 5,000 square foot houses or anything like that, but for me, quality is important, and it's okay to spend more on that because it's something I spend a lot of time at home. So it's number one for me. And then I like to minimize the amount of upkeep that my house requires. So I like to build houses, for example. So I like make them really dependable and low maintenance, and I like them to be self-heating and self-cooling with like a lot of nice passive features, you know, with the windows in the right place and the ventilation and everything, so it hardly ever needs heat or air conditioning. So like, that's my thing, and I don't try to get people to skimp on their housing unless they don't care about housing, in which case, absolutely get the smallest little studio or get a bunch of roommates if you want to. But that part of it is not really, you know, what I try to minimize. And then the other category of like your miscellaneous spending, that can be stripped back down if you want to. Like, definitely strip out waste and food. You should spend enough to get high quality food, but a lot of people spend more and get low quality food, you know, just by going out to low quality restaurants all the time. And so that's an easy thing to improve as well. And that cuts a huge part of it. Like at a middle class level, you can cut, you know, $1,000+ off per month just by optimizing your food. Because a lot of people just go out to restaurants and order like $15 glasses of wine every day without even thinking about it.
It gets hard not to, you know, all these good places. But I think that's an interesting thing too that I wanted to ask you about, which is as it pertains to the built environment and to building human scale neighborhoods, right? We talk about mixed use a lot. That's what we have here at Cul-de-sac. That's what a lot of the most successful neighborhoods in the world and in the United States are. They definitely fit into that mixed use categorization. A lot of the message around being smart with our money often revolves not going out as much to eat or to, you know, do things outside of the home. It's much better to make food at home. Typically, I mean, when I think about my personal budget, the weeks that I eat at home more, I'm saving, you know, upwards of $100 some on, you know, just basic food and stuff. It's not even close. But that message, how do you think that plays with the shop local, you know, patronize your local vendors and retailers sort of bit too? Because oftentimes those smaller shops have higher, this is kind of a message that I hear a lot as well. Those small stores that you are advocating for being closer to home, they cost more money. The goods there are more, you know, they have smaller supply. Their supply chain's not as streamlined. So for all those reasons, goods cost more. How do you balance saving money and being financially smart with your week-to-week, day-to-day purchases with also supporting the neighborhood and community and the mixed-use nature of that? Because that feels like there could be, for some people, some friction in terms of those decisions that they have to make.
Yeah. Well, I think if you think about a neighborhood as a block of units that can be either housing or commercial or restaurants, the amount of money that people want to spend on their going out activities and, you know, choose to and can afford to spend, that's going to determine the balance. So like if a lot of people are frugal, that's totally fine. You're just going to have a lot of housing and you're going to have less restaurants in that block of neighborhoods. And that's actually not necessarily a bad thing, because a small number of restaurants can still do well. You know, if people are going out to dinner once a week, that's going to serve a certain number of restaurants. If it's like New York and people go out to dinner 5 nights a week, then you'll need 5 times as many restaurants, which just shifts the balance, but it can still be a great neighborhood. The fundamental thing for me, I don't mind if there's a lot of housing and if there's not a lot of restaurants. All I really care about is that there's not a lot of cars. You know, there shouldn't be a huge street and parking lot ripping through the neighborhood, because that's no good for the humans who want to play outside with their kids.
Absolutely.
And then what there should be is great parks and green spaces and walking trails like all over the place. And whether the balance is heavily commercial or heavily residential, either way, everybody should be willing to spend their money. And in this case, it would probably be in the form of like having some taxes, which we do, right? We have property taxes, and that's why our city governments can afford to have parks and walking trails. So we should keep that and make sure we still have those things. And the good news is that right now our tax money also subsidizes this crappy stuff, which is like parking lots and roads, which are more expensive than parks. You know, it's like $1 million per lane mile to make a basic road. And you can make a hell of a park for $1 million.
Oh yeah.
And a lot more people enjoy it than just like one lane of asphalt. Absolutely. So anyway, I feel like we can have way better places all around our houses while spending like the same amount we spend now or less or whatever's needed. And it'll still be a vibrant neighborhood.
Totally. And you bring up something interesting there, which I also was curious to get your thoughts on. You obviously talk about finance a lot as it pertains to the individual and their habits and how they can kind of build their life and customize their life in a way that fits them. When you kind of scale some of your philosophies to a city level, does it stay in the same vein of, like, if we just because what I love about your work, and this is, again, something that I think ties in perfectly to this conversation, is we have so many people right now talking about how to get rich quick, make more money, and it seems to all be about the incoming money. Yours is mostly about outgoing. You're talking about spending more than anything, which I love, because I think that's what the whole car cost thing comes down to, right? It's no matter what income you're at, you will have more money if you don't drive, if you don't own a car. That is just math straight in front of you. But when it comes to a city level, how does your kind of thinking on spending go? Do you still stick with kind of that more stripped down version of, hey, let's try to be lean and make things happen more organically? Or do you think that on a wider scale like that with the economy of scale there, that it actually is better for kind of endowment from the city into things versus just empowerment of people? Like that's an interesting distinction, I think.
I see what you're thinking. So you're talking about, like, should the government try to be frugal with its money, just like I'm proposing for the people to be frugal with their money? And I would say, a little bit less so, but at the same time, if you think about an individual person, if I'm telling them to spend less money going out to dinner or putting gas in their car, what are they doing with the money they save? Well, they're investing it, right? They're in this case, they're buying portions of companies or real estate that's like a productive asset. I would say that cities probably have a lot of fat in their budget. Like in my town, there's like the city workers are always driving around in these huge V8 engine pickup trucks that are empty. Like they should have a fleet of old Priuses to drive around and then use the pickup trucks when you actually have to tow something or carry something big. And why pickup trucks? Why can't it be minivans, which hold more than a pickup truck but use less gas, right? So cities are full of, especially because they're not even spending their own money, they're spending like the budget. I feel like they're super inefficient, and they could probably cut down their spending by like about half without even compromising any services, because half of it is just wasted. And then you take that half and then, start thinking about investments rather than spending. Like, anytime you put money into a park or a walkway or a bike trail that people use, that's generating wealth in the city, because like the people get out of the house and they're healthier and they're going to meet each other and they're going to start more businesses. Whereas if you're just spending money on something that people never enjoy, like gasoline to be burned in the work trucks, or like maybe an office that nobody uses, that's not an investment, because it's not, resulting in the citizens having better lives. So just get better with that. We shouldn't try to cut our taxes down to zero and have no government, because I feel like that's just going to lead to no good public spaces. And public spaces are really, really high leverage. Like a $1 spent by a city can create tens or hundreds of dollars of wealth in the private sector, just because there's these nice things that people enjoy being near.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, that makes me think about a lot. I think that there's so much to be said for this balance between giving people space, I guess is how I'd phrase it, to create things for themselves. And we've talked about this a little bit offline as well, of this idea of leaving spaces to be customized and leaving room for people to take risks and not having everything be so structured in our built environments, which is hard because the built environment inherently is a structured thing, right? We're talking about really harsh and hard surfaces like asphalt or concrete and things that aren't very malleable over time. But you've said things along the lines of using that as a canvas and allowing for residents and people of these neighborhoods to really take up and be the ones who drive a lot of the overtime change, which I think is totally in line with like what Jane Jacobs and others have said over time, which is that we can't artificially create longevity in neighborhoods. That has to happen organically through the residents. And so, yeah, I think I was just very curious about your thoughts on kind of the government's role in that, just because I think that's a very split thing. But I think it also speaks to right now we've seen an interesting thing happen where there's a lot of progress in like blue cities that are in red states because the balance seems to work well when there's low building regulations at a state level and, permitting regulations. But then there is kind of this more progressive, for lack of better terms, mindset around building places that center people and that provide things for them, other than just driveways and roads to get to and from things. So very, very interesting there.
Yeah, that would be good with a slideshow, that little monologue you just gave. It would be nice if people could have real examples of, some spaces that cities have done where that happened.
I mean, I think Tempe's actually interestingly a good example of that here, right? Arizona, pretty red place. I know Ryan and I have talked in previous years about Ryan Johnson, cul-de-sac founder that was on last week. We've talked before about how doing what they did, and Ryan said this to a million people, not just me, but what they did here in Tempe with cul-de-sac, this first project where we're sitting right now, would have taken them, 15 years, 10 years more in California to do the same thing.
Oh, I
right?
see. Yeah. Cause they had a bunch of rules they had to change.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting because on the surface, cul-de-sac feels like a very California idea. It feels like it would do well in populations of people there, but it actually doesn't, maybe because of certain other things that come into play. So I just think there's a lot of, to your point, interesting examples and interesting things that we could put together to show some people, because I think that does tend to happen. And I think it speaks to the value of balance in thinking and also balance in how we look at money in the state and city level. So much to be studied there. I'm not claiming to have any conclusive evidence from that, but I think it is at least something that, makes you perk your ears up and want to hear a little bit more about and learn more from. So I do want to talk about, you mentioned briefly your kind of pastime now that you spend some time on, which is being a craftsman and building homes and structures and really getting your hands dirty with those sorts of things and actually being a part of building things physically. And you kind of beat me to my question, which I was going to ask about passive housing, because I'm fascinated by that. It's a goal of mine some days to build something that, in here, I haven't turned the air or heat on since I moved in. I turned it off the moment I walked in the door. I have turned it on.
I did the same thing. It's
great. And yes, we live in Arizona and it's wintertime. Understand that that's a, certain instance that not everyone has access to, but I've always been fascinated by the way that one can create a structure that we've always, again, foregone concluded that it has to be run by heater, cooling, all that, but it maybe doesn't have to be. And we can utilize the sun. We can utilize other things to create a structure that does all that on its own. So you've done some projects that were totally passive then? You've worked on some...
I wasn't super hardcore about it,
okay.
Like where I refused to put in a furnace or anything. Sure. In Colorado, there's more heating than cooling over the course of the year, but I just try to do the best that I can without getting ridiculous on the design. Yeah. Because if you want to be really purist, you have to make the house extremely heavy. For example, you have to have lots and lots of like 2-foot thick concrete walls to store the heat, and, perhaps even active shutters to let in the sun only at the right times. And that gets actually more expensive than just having the middle ground where you have, I always just put lots of big south facing windows, which gather a lot of heat in the winter. And then in the summer, the sun is up higher overhead, so hardly any sun comes in those same windows. And then you can cut the rest off with an overhang. That's one of the classic principles of a passive house in a cooler climate. And stuff like some heavy things inside, like concrete floor, rock walls, those work great. And then I'll just use an efficient furnace and air conditioner as little as possible. And in that case, the place, the last house I built from scratch was a few years ago, and I put a wood burning fireplace in it as well. Just because I really love chopping and burning wood, and it's in an area where wood burning is okay. And I have a super clean burning wood stove too that reburns all its own smoke. So by the time it comes out the chimney and the roof, you can hardly even smell the smoke, and you don't see any smoke, vapor. So it's kind of just like a modern version of a wood stove, and you can heat the entire house with just a few logs. So all that stuff is just, I really enjoy it. And I'm kind of overdue to build a new house from scratch, because
that's exciting.
It's just so fun to do that, and then to live in the space you created. And the house I'm in now is like something that already existed. I've changed it a lot, but I totally didn't build it myself. So I think I'm feeling the itch
Getting the
to
itch?
do it again. Yeah.
That's awesome. No, that's super cool. I'm curious, do you think that those ideas of like that sort of hybrid passive housing, we'll call it, could scale like at a neighborhood level or a city level?
Oh yeah. I mean, if anybody cares at all, like the builder or the buyer, and then which would make the builder care, you can make any house more efficient, especially at the design stage. It's just that people generally don't care. And it's the same reason fuel efficiency for cars is so low in the United States, is nobody really cares about fuel efficiency. Like if they did, pickup trucks would not exist. You know, like it's so stupid. These things get like 15 miles a gallon. And you can have a great car that gets 50 or 60 miles a gallon and still carries 5 people. But people buy the trucks just because they're like, I like trucks. I saw it on the Super Bowl once, and like, then that's the end of the thought process. And then they use it to drive to work, like empty. So in a country or, a society where nobody cares about stuff like this, it remains a niche thing. And that's why Mr. Money Mustache has to write articles about it, because I want more people to care about it. So through my writing, I'm trying to get more people excited about these ideas. And sure, it saves you money, but it also saves everybody else some hassle too, because you're destroying the earth less as well.
Yeah, for sure. What has the response been like as you start to talk about those sorts of pieces in your work from your audience? Like when you do talk about things like downsizing cars and things of that nature, what are the sorts of conversations that arise as a result of those sorts of things? People's eyes being open to that. And
I think they like it as long as you frame it in a benefit for them way. Like nobody wants to be shamed by like, the left wing eco nannies.
Sure.
So I try to focus on like freedom, American, like you'll be rich and strong and everybody will like you more and you'll have more power.
Totally.
If you do this stuff. And, that is really how it works. I'm not just making this stuff up. Like it really is a more powerful lifestyle, but that's just what I focus on because, I realize, I am a marketing person at heart, just like naturally.
Yeah.
So I understand that you have to frame things the right way if you want people to like the ideas.
Totally. I love that you just said the whole freedom thing too, because I'm large, and this isn't something I explicitly have stated a ton, but a large part of my aim with this project is to make this not a one-sided political thing, and like to not make it always seem like the, rah-rah environmentalist advocates. Not that, again, there's not a role there to be played, but I also think that tying this in, and again, this is why I love your approach to the financial side of this, is that there is such a freedom and financial side to this argument to downsize car ownership, to get away from that as an individual and as a country. And I think that sometimes folks in our sphere are afraid to talk about those things because it feels like a right-leaning conversation point. But I think it's exactly in line with everything that, the urbanist movement and urban design enthusiasts are really looking at. It's at the core of what they're saying. So I totally love that you just brought that up. I think it's a huge part of this that we need to keep talking about, which is, hey, at the end of the day, people care about saving money, right? Like they just do. And you do. When you do these things in a certain way, you save money.
Yeah. Or even a better way to phrase it is having money.
Yes.
Saving money sounds a little bit like a compromise, like, ooh, I don't want to have to save. But people just like being rich. And the only way to be rich is to spend less money than you earn. That's just the math behind it. So, we say saving quietly, but we say having money loudly because we want to have, everybody wants to have a lot and be free because of it.
No, that's super interesting. I love that point. That I'm going to start using that for sure. One other thing that I remembered from that Tim Ferriss episode that we mentioned earlier was you told a story about your son when he was younger and how you would incentivize him to ride his bike.
That was a long time ago.
Yeah, by paying him to. This was one of the main things that stuck with me from that because. Well, for those that are wondering, you used to incentivize by, you had an odometer on your son's bike, and based on how many miles he'd ride, you would pay him, I think it was 10 cents or something like that. And I love that. Stuck with me because my girlfriend and I talk a lot about, we intend to do a one car household for forever. And whenever kids come into the equation, how we can, as they near their teenage years, try to incentivize them to not want to get their car the day they turn 16, like all their friends will be doing. And it's like, it feels like a lost cause times. And then I heard I remembered your idea, and I was like, this might be the key. This might be the way.
But at the same time, I feel like there's a behavioral science principle where if you pay somebody to do something that they like already, then they don't like it as much. So you got to watch out not to tread into that, in the way you phrase it with your kid. I feel like my son was never really all that incentivized by the 10 cents per mile anyway. He just wanted to bike with his mom and dad.
Yeah.
So, but I wanted to have an excuse to give him some spending money so he could learn to manage money too. So that was just like my way of having his allowance get created, I guess, a different version of allowance. I still think it's a good idea though. And for some kids, like for me, I was very positively incentivized by money ever since I knew what money was. So it totally would have worked for me, and it would have not made me dislike biking more. So I still think it's a fine thing to try for kids.
Yeah. Is there anything else like that you think are really applicable pieces of advice that people listening to this could apply, maybe that connect to the interest of, downsizing on cars, all the things we've talked about? But from your standpoint, from the sorts of work that you do, is there anything you would recommend, like in a 1 month or 6 month strategy for folks to start deploying and implementing in their lives?
And how to become less car dependent?
Yes. But also to have money, not save money. Look, well, I'm changing my mind already.
So first thing is to remember is most people think of their car as something that costs money per month. That's not correct. It costs money per mile. So when you drive your car, every time you put a mile on it, that's sucking, between 50 cents and $1 of your wealth away. When your car is parked, for the most part, it's not burning money nearly as quickly. Like it's depreciating and stuff, but most of the depreciation comes from miles, where you burn it up. The engine gets worn out and the tires and everything else, and the maintenance and gasoline too. Yeah. But gasoline is the smallest of your costs. Most people think gas is the only cost of the car. So the main goal is to not throw as many of your dollar bills into the shredder. I like to pretend if you have a car, every time you start it up, you have to throw like a $10 bill into the slot in the dashboard and it goes, and it just shreds it and you never see it again. And then every time you go another mile, you have to put another $1 into the shredder. Yeah. That's a good way to visualize the car operating. And then if that really happened, people would hardly ever drive. They're like, oh shit, man, I don't want to burn up all these valuable dollars that I just earned at my job. And then they would use the car only for important stuff. Like, all right, we're going to plan our errands out. We're going to not drive for no reason. And we're going to use the car. And it's very valuable for certain things. And it's totally worth like $100 to go on a camping trip. So you'll do it, but you wouldn't just, drive 2 towns away to go for a drive because it's costing you $100 and you'd rather not lose that 100. So that's number one. And then number 2 is learn the alternatives to cars, which is biking. Most people don't realize that biking is both easy and it's pretty much as fast as driving if you're staying within a city, a metro area, because the average speed of a car in a metro area is like 20 miles an hour or less. Yeah. And bikes can often go that fast, especially if you have an e-bike, and they often have access to faster, less congested routes that maybe have less, distance to them. So bikes really get you around fast. They're really cheap. Obviously, they're good for your health too. But most Americans don't have a bike. So the first thing you got to do is get like a all-in-one, super easy to use bike that just plain works, with a bike lock that clicks into it so you can never lose it. And it has to have a combination, not a key, so you don't lose the key. And it has to have lights on the front and back so you can use it at night and it can be safe. Like everything that a car has, right? Like when you go into a car, it already has lights. You already know you're not going to lose the key because it's like you take really good care of your car key. And so, it's super safe and convenient. So if you have a bike that's as convenient as a car, then you can suddenly start using it. Yeah. And then you just try it. Like try going to the closest grocery store with a backpack or whatever and just getting like, a couple avocados and a bag of coffee or something. And then once you have that little win, you're like, wait a minute, that wasn't so hard. And then you start doing more and more and you bike with your kids to school and you do other things like this, all within like a 1 or 2 mile radius. And that already cuts down your car use a lot. And then your body starts to get in better bicycling shape. And then it's all like a positive snowball from there.
Yeah. And majority of our trips are within, 3 miles. So it's what you're talking about there is very scalable, and it's very reasonable to think that could overtake the vast majority of your trips in not that long of an amount of time. And like you said, removing that friction is such a big piece. We love, and the bike community loves the little bells and whistles that are customizable. You take on and off all this stuff, but that's not what the average American is going to invest in as their primary mode of transportation. So I love that you brought that up as well. And I think that's some great advice for folks. I would love to touch on, so one of the cool things we like to do on this show is talk about kind of the unassuming places in the U.S. that might be doing some things well. Boston, New York City, San Francisco, they get all the headlines as it pertains to great urbanism and things like that in pockets. But I'm really fascinated by this idea of walkable pockets that exist around the U.S. of places that don't get talked about, that you can get some walkability, some ability to maybe own one less car than your family does right now, or to go car free at a much friendlier budget and price point than one of those large coastal cities would offer you. I know you've lived for a while in Longmont, Colorado, out near Boulder, outside Denver. Mm-hmm. You've told me the other day that there's quite a bit of walkability and bikeability in that town. Would you mind just sharing a little bit about the town of Longmont and just maybe your pitch as to why you live there and why it might be a cool place for people to at least visit or consider spending some more time in? Because I don't know if a lot of people have heard of it. So
yeah, well, there's nothing particularly special about Longmont, but the thing to know about it that makes it walkable and bikeable, as well as its next door city, Boulder, is they're both small cities, like about 100,000 people each. And each one is 5 miles by 5 miles, kind of circular shaped. Yeah. So if you live in the middle of it, which I do, then it's only 2.5 miles to any place in the town, which is a short bike ride. And it's still big enough at that size to get a lot of people, like a lot of services, everything you need, movie theaters, good restaurants, all that other stuff. Especially Boulder, because that's got like a great university and it's got high-end restaurants, but that's also a really, really rich enclave, like the houses start at $1 million there. Yeah. So you really pay for the perfection of Boulder, but it also has amazing bike paths. So that's kind of like the Saks Fifth Avenue of bikeable, walkable cities.
I like that.
Anybody who's rich enough should just move to Boulder and enjoy it, or like, California equivalent of it. But for the rest of us, there's parts of every city in the United States that are quite walkable and bikeable. And the key that I like to do is just use the Google Maps test initially. Like you bring up Google Maps, put it on satellite view, works on Apple Maps too, of course. And then you just look for grocery stores because that's the thing you need most. And then scroll around and look for neighborhoods that also have housing and parks and school, if you have kids that need to be in school, that are also within a couple miles of a grocery store, preferably 1 mile. And then you just, search around and then identify these areas. And then you visit it in person if you're in the market to move to a house, apartment too. And then really you get the vibe and then you pick something that works. Mm-hmm. And there's in almost every city, like definitely every city I've ever studied, I've always been able to find these little clusters of like mixture of housing, schools, parks, probably some restaurants too, and grocery store that are all in a chunk. So it's like a mini Longmont or a mini Boulder. Might not be as glamorous, but it's still like a wonderful life and a great place to raise kids, especially if there's a park, a nature area, like a little ravine or a creek or whatever. Like, and you don't have to think of the whole city. Like you're sitting in front of a map of Phoenix right here, which is like 60 miles wide and 60 miles tall. And if you think of that as all one city, then you're going to be driving all the time because, you could drive 36,000 miles a year and never leave Phoenix.
Yeah.
Or you could say, well, no, I live in, central Tempe. So that's my city. And I don't go to Peoria or Buckeye or whatever. Maybe I do for a special vacation, but I don't just like randomly sign my kid up for guitar lessons in Buckeye because then I'm going to have to do a 120-mile round trip drive every time Junior needs a guitar lesson. Yeah. And that's ridiculous. Yeah. Right? So just don't even open your mind to those areas. And then suddenly your mind opens to the exact same thing. Like, oh, wow. My next door neighbor is a guitar teacher. Well, I guess we'll take guitar lessons there. Mm-hmm. That's really how you get your driving down and your local life up, is to just pretend these faraway things don't exist.
Absolutely. Yeah. Vacation in Buckeye. I have some friends that are going to laugh at that one because I don't know if many people do that, but hey, maybe there's probably some walkable pockets there even so.
I know the Buckeye is like a bunch of new luxury, like poolside home developments getting built just because I have a friend who lives there, but I took a vacation to Apache Junction just beyond, where
Other side of the valley.
you know, the Superstition Mountains and Canyon Lake. There's like a mini Grand Canyon over there and camping and everything. And it was a 45-minute drive each way, which was no problem because I was just doing it that one time.
Sure.
If that was my daily commute, it would suck. Yeah. But to do it once, I was like, this is an amazing vacation. I'm in a whole different place.
Right.
Like instead of being in the middle of this 5 million person city, I'm now in this completely silent mountaintop looking down at a crystal clear blue lake. And so it like felt special because it was rare.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that too speaks to something that is, you know, you live in a simpler place sometimes and localize your life. It makes things more enthralling and special when you do go to different places, and then you're able to see and really observe differences, and you're able to appreciate little things more. You know, I know so many folks that I know that have lived out here in Phoenix for their whole life for a long time. They don't even see the mountains when they walk outside. And that is like my biggest fear, is becoming desensitized to the things that exist in a place that don't exist elsewhere. And I actually think weirdly, if you kind of localize and simplify your life a little bit, those things become more enchanting, we'll call it, in different ways. So I love that kind of sentiment as well. I did want to ask you, you know, you're from Canada, I've lived in some different spots there. Do you find anything that you see in Canadian cities or Canadian towns that you think U.S. cities and towns could adopt, or are they quite similar in a lot of ways? I'm curious kind of the distinction there.
Yeah, from most of Canada that I've been to, it's pretty similar. They're both just like car-based designs, pretty bad. You know, like Ontario, I'm from Ontario, like near the giant city of Toronto. That's among the very worst. Like they just keep expanding the highways. Even to this day, they're like, well, the traffic's getting bad. We better add another lane. And like this road, this thing called Highway 401 that goes through Toronto, it's like way bigger than any highway in Phoenix and yet way more jammed. It's like induced demand.
Yep.
Like in the textbooks, it's like that brought to life. I think that highway gets up to, I don't know, like 24 lanes wide at some points. It just goes forever and it's just so jammed. About 20 hours a day there's a traffic jam, and there's only like, it's only between the hours of like midnight and 4 a.m. that it's not a traffic jam. It's just such a disaster. Sure. So Canada is not solving the car problem. They do have the city of Montreal though, which is a big city, super European style compared to anything else I've seen in the US. And they bike a lot there. Like they have really good bike lanes, and the culture is just different, where people just choose to ride their bikes, even though it has not a very good climate. They make the most of it. And there's like beautiful people all over the place. I don't know where they get all these beautiful people, but they're like, it makes biking look more fun.
Yeah.
And the other thing is they wear normal clothes and they don't wear bike helmets, which is the European style way of biking. And they have like these stylish bikes. So it's like, you know, it just makes, that's how biking should be everywhere, I think. And it's safer too, because there's a lot of cyclists and the cars are, there's not as big roads for cars, and therefore it becomes better for everybody.
Totally. Yeah. And I think that there's a beauty in continuing to highlight these really amazing, and I love that you used European as a word to describe Montreal, because these examples of places that are a lot closer to home that we can go to get international travel and exposure to these ideas that are not investing in a massive European vacation. Like if you're in a city here, Mexico City is an example, great transit, great bus system. Montreal is an example. If you want to get outside the US and get good examples of urbanism and things that we can apply to our communities, to your point, there's some really strong ones that are not nearly as far and expensive to get to. So highly recommend checking those out. The last question that we ask every guest, I'm very excited to hear your answer to this. So this show is called Good Traffic. A lot of what we're trying to do is look at this thing that's unanimously agreed upon as terrible, and we all, hate sitting in traffic, and therefore a lot of us have come to really despise our commutes on a daily basis. But a lot of places in the world, and a lot of cities even in the US, amongst certain populations, the commute is one of the best parts of the day. It's this beautiful dynamic thing that doesn't have to be just getting point A to point B, but it's actually this beautiful process that we get to undergo. So
what do you mean if you're not in a car?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
So, well, yeah, I mean, I guess for some people, but yes, largely. So I think with that in mind, I'd love to just know, out of all the places you've lived, what's been your favorite commute that you've ever had?
I think it's right now, because I have a house in the southwest corner of downtown Longmont, and then I also happen to have a commercial building that's right on the main street. We have just one street that's literally called Main Street. So we have with some friends, I co-own a co-working space on the main street. It's about 1.5 miles from my house, 1.3 maybe. So I just walk there, but it's a really beautiful walk because it has a variety of like steep hills and neighborhoods and, you know, parks. I cut through some parks, and I have all these different ways that I walk to the headquarters. And when I'm in a rush, I bike. But when I have the time, it takes like close to 30 minutes to walk there. And it's just super nice and feels luxurious and sauntering, you know, and I'll have my backpack that has like the laptop and maybe a couple tools in it because I'm usually working on the building. And that just feels great to walk half an hour to get to work through a nice quiet neighborhood. And then you work all day, which is typically a physical job for me.
Okay.
And then I'm already kind of tired, but then I have to walk home because I have no other choice. And that just feels really good to just push yourself a little bit, walk home, come down the hill to my house. And then, you know, I'm usually ravenous for a huge dinner at that point, and everything tastes better after you've had a big physical day. So anytime you can have a long walking commute, I think that's the absolute gold standard of a commute is walking. And then biking is a close second. And then everything else is down from there.
Couldn't agree more. That's beautiful. Well, Pete, Mr. Money Mustache, thank you so much for coming on the show today and for being in good traffic with us.
It's my pleasure. I can't wait to see how this show turns out as it keeps growing.
We'll keep working on it.